Very good afternoon, all of you. Welcome you for this inaugural talk on our BRIS lecture series. And that was our planning since a long time to start this program. And then idea is to that all of you know that ITs have been set up with the mandate of the engineering higher education in engineering with the departments of sciences and humanities. And aim was that to have a better integration of those different aspects. Uh, in the past, we have seen that good amount of research collaboration we have seen between engineering and sciences department, but still the interaction and the research collaboration between the HSS aspect or socio-economic aspect is still at the nascent stage. And even though this is an emerging area at the global scale is there, IIT Gandhinagar has a very strong emphasis on the in the teaching program to include the humanities and sciences courses in BTech and PG courses is there. So IIT Gandhinagar is very well placed to take a lead in these areas, which is currently is not there at a major step at the country level. So considering this aspect, we are going to start this series, which is called the BRIS lecture series. And aim is to listen what are the challenges, what are the success stories, and we hope that you people will get some new ideas that how you can add your research work to the next stage. You will also learn that what are the difficulties or challenges are there and what could be achieved with those results. So with the same, I welcome you all, and in near future we will have more such talks. And so with this, I invite Professor Ashish to then introduce this.
Thank you, Professor Jain. This is indeed a historic moment for all of us because we have been planning to launch this series for a while now, and I'm very happy that we are beginning this series in the new year with Professor Paul Kirshen. He'll be talking to us today about integration of social and biophysical sciences, the case studies related to water management, why, how, and illustrating it with examples. I won't stand between you and him. I'll just give a brief introduction about Professor Kirshen, and then we'll have the lecture. Professor Paul Kirshen is professor in School of the Environment at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the founding research director of the Stone Living Lab for nature-based solutions for urban coastal resiliency and restoration. He has more than 40 years of experience serving as the principal investigator of complex interdisciplinary and participatory research and consulting related to water resources, coastal zone, and infrastructure management under present and future uncertain climates. He was the lead author of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, Water Resources in North America, and the 2014 US National Climate Assessment of the Coastal Zone. His recent research includes the use of NBS for Metro Boston, seeking climate justice in East Boston, integrated adaptation strategies to climate change for the Kosi River, development of robust policies for urban NBS projects, and the Massachusetts statewide climate assessment. His research on the impacts of climate change has been cited by the US Supreme Court. He received his SSB in engineering from Brown University and his MS and PhD in civil and engineering from the MIT. With that very brief bio note, I welcome Professor Paul Kirshen, and I invite all of you to give him a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at IIT. And I want to thank Professor Jain for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to speak to you today about some of my work. So what I'm going to talk about is essentially looking at water problems through an integrated lens, through the lens of both biophysical sciences and social sciences. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it's necessary to do this, and then talk a little bit about how it's done, and then talk about some examples. But I want to point out that there's no right or wrong way to do this. There are many methods that can be used to do this. But the point is, for certain problems, you need to do it. I thought I'd just show you where UMass Boston is. We are right on the coast of Boston, and we're on a peninsula, and we're presently, 8 feet above the present 100-year flood. So we're safe from sea level rise. This modern building here is where my office is, and also where Michelle's office is. And we have a campus of about 15,000 undergraduates and about 3,000 or 4,000 graduate students. And it's interesting, your campus is a lot less dense than our campus, and we have very tall buildings. Okay, so that's the world. And then, okay, so it's important to understand where I come from. So my background is civil engineering, and the reason I studied civil engineering is because I see civil engineering as the interface between humans and the environment. Civil engineers are worried about how to meet the needs of humans, how to provide water, how to provide transportation, provide clean air quality, get rid of wastewater. And in so doing, we are always working with the environment. So that's why I got involved in civil engineering. Also, my research is very applied. In the university world, there's a group of people that are creating knowledge, and there's a group of people that are applying knowledge. And I've created some knowledge, and most of my work is applying knowledge. And most of my work is what we call action research in the United States. It's really aimed at solving, real world problems through doing research. And some of my research has been quite impactful. For example, it was mentioned that some of my work has been cited by the US Supreme Court on the economic damages of climate change to the United States. Some of my work has been used to set policies for how to subsidize small-scale hydropower in the United States. Some of my work has been used to, guide the state of Massachusetts and how they do coastal flood protection and so on. So it's interesting. And I also want to point out, when you do this sort of work, if it does get into the policy world, it's really important that it really be correct. And you really can't cut corners. So it's really going to be based upon sound science. And so getting back to, why we need to consider the human dimension in water management. These are just a couple of little examples. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see, these obviously apply to humans, and many of them apply to water. So if we're going to be looking at Sustainable Development Goals, we've got to look at both the biophysical aspects of water, but also the human dimension part of it. Another example is in 1973, US water policy said that water managers have to consider 4 impacts of water management. One was economic, one was regional development, one was social well-being, and one was environmental. So if you were planning a dam or a water supply system or any water resource project, you had to determine the impacts of that system on these 4 accounts. And this work came out of the famous Harvard Water Program, which is interesting because the early part of the water program was funded by the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States. The second part of the water program was funded by the Ford Foundation, and much of that research was done in India. So when I was studying this, a lot of the examples I read about economic aspects of water were based upon, rupees instead of dollars. So it's sort of interesting for me to be back in India. So anyway, it's essentially mandated by law in the United States. You have to consider these impacts. And then, of course, there's this whole field called integrated water resource management. And IWRM is based on the equitable and efficient management, sustainable use of water, and recognizes that water is an integral part of the ecosystem, a natural resource, and a social and environmental good whose quantity and quality determine the nature of its utilization. So again, this paradigm for water management is calling for the integration of the biophysical and the social aspects, social dimensions of water. There's a new field now called multi-sector dynamics, which essentially is looking at how use of any resource or any problem impacts multiple sectors. So like water use impacts irrigation, impacts hydropower, it impacts industry, business. And so when you analyze all these things, you always have to look at the availability of the water, the biophysical problem, but also look at how it's used by these human uses. And then finally, you've probably all heard about the water, food, energy nexus. And so some of the recent work I've done, we've now added nutrients to that. But obviously, when you look at the way these systems interact, you have to look at the biophysics behind it, but also the human dimensions. And water is certainly a large part of that cycle. And then, this is sort of the most complete consideration of integrated water resource management, the so-called coupled human and natural systems system. So up here you can see, the natural system, the human system, and they're always interacting and impacting each other. So water is a classic example of a coupled natural and human system. So this is sort of why we need to consider this. And then a little bit about how we do this. So when I do my research, I like to work within a framework. And so the framework I work in most right now is the climate risk framework of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. And then you see in the center of this disaster risk right here. And the risk is a function of the hazard, right? Like, let's say a flood. And it's also a function of the exposure. What gets exposed to that flood? Like how many houses, how many hectares of farmland, and so on. And that's also, the risk is also a function of the vulnerability of that system. And vulnerability is a function of the sensitivity of that system to the exposure. For example, I always put it as, so what if a house gets flooded? That's its sensitivity. So what if a person gets flooded? That's the sensitivity of that person to the flood. And the last component of vulnerability is adaptive capacity. Essentially, what can that system do? What can that system do to adjust to the threat? Are there options for it to adjust to that threat? So, one of the classic examples is, wealthy people have a lot more adaptive capacity than poorer people. A wealthy person can essentially buy themselves out of climate change, whereas a lower income person doesn't have that many options. So, I often analyze problems, both dealing with present climate as well as future climate, using this framework of what risk is, a function of the, what the hazard is, what the exposure to that hazard is, and what the vulnerability of the system is to that hazard. Another framework is, sorry, wrong button. Okay, sorry. I never use pointers. I got it. No, my fault. Another framework. Okay, that might be easier. Yeah. Okay. So another framework you may have heard about is called driver pressure state impact response. And essentially, as shown here, you look at the driver on a system. So this is one taken from the environmental world. So a driver might be, the human need to get rid of wastewater. And the pressure is what pressure is exerted on the environment from that. So what happens to the wastewater? And what that does is it impacts the state of an ecosystem. And if you change the state, of an impact of an ecosystem, you impact it, and you impact the services provided by that ecosystem. And that goes back to how it impacts, the human needs, the driver. And then, of course, when you respond, there are all sorts of ways you can respond, which can impact the drivers, the pressure, the state, or the impact. I don't like to use this because it's got too many components. But I still want to go back, though. I'm thinking about this. This framework, when we use it, the climate change work, we look at the disaster risk of a system under the present climate and under the future climate. But then we go back and say, okay, how can we adapt? What are the levers we have to adapt the system to the present threats and the future threats? So the levers are, well, we really can't change the hazard too much, but we can change the exposure. Like if we're worried about flooding, we can move out of the floodplain. That would eliminate the exposure. In terms of the vulnerability, well, another lever we have is we can reduce the sensitivity. So let's say we can elevate a home. And then the adaptive capacity might be, we set up a really good flood warning system so people know if a flood's coming, they can move. But the point is, when you're doing this analysis, you've done the analysis, then you want to ask the question, okay, how do I adjust this to lower the risk? So these are your levers. You can change the hazard a little bit, maybe, but you can change the exposure and you can change the vulnerability. So those are the levers you have to decrease the risk. So it's a nice framework to work in. Okay. And then the other thing is some tools you can use to do this integrated assessment. And there are many, many tools out there. But in water management, particularly if it involves a water supply problem, we always want to do a water balance. We want to balance, we want to determine what the demands are for the water, the human side. Then we want to look at where the water is coming from, sort of the biophysical side. And a nice little tool for doing that is this model called WEAP, developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And you can take out an urban drainage or a watershed, and you can input the demands by category and whether they're consumptive or non-consumptive. And then you can also input the physical resource. Another tool for integrating human and biophysical components is agent-based modeling. You probably can't see this too well, but agent-based modeling is a simulation system where we simulate the performance of agents over time and how they interact with each other, and also interact with the resource. So this is one that was looking at coastal flooding. So essentially, we have several agents across the top, which are we have a municipality, we have a land developer, we have regional assets, meaning like a regional water supply system, we have a public transportation system, and then we might have a regional management authority. So these are the players in the system, the human side, and they're responding to floods, to changing over time because of climate change. But also these agents are responding to each other. Sometimes they're competing for resources, competing for financing. Sometimes one agent is regulating another agent and so on. And every agent also has their own motives. So how do these all interact? So an agent-based modeling system lets you simulate the behavior of these agents over time. And then in theory, you can simulate what's going to happen over time to, let's say, the vulnerability of the Boston coastline. Then you can say, let me change the policies, the way the agents interact, and let's see if that improves the resiliency of the coastline. So what we're looking at here is the present system in Massachusetts, is the agents really don't cooperate too much. They will more or less work independently. We want to use the system to test out, say we had a central regional authority managing coastal flooding in Boston. So instead of having like 5 agents sort of working independently. So we had a regional authority that was making them all work together and cooperate. Would coastal resiliency be better? And with this system, we can do this experiment. You can't do this in the real world because we're trying to, go forward in time. But with this modeling tool, we can simulate, hopefully get some guidance on the way it might play out. There are many more. So there's a tool called System Dynamics. There's also a modeling system called Mortem. So there are many, many tools which let you integrate social and biophysical systems. And the other thing is, I talked, they were computer models. Another way to simulate the interplay of social and biophysical systems is with a role-playing simulation game. So this doesn't really, this might take some inputs from, computer models, let's say coastal flooding, but the simulation is done by people playing a role-playing game. So this is an example of one for managing flooding in a town by a river in New Hampshire. And so this describes the problem. It's a flood problem. And then in the game, people are assigned to play a role. So in this game, there's a civil engineer, there's a planning director, there's a public works director, there's the business people, and so on. And in every role, you have an instruction sheet. And so you play that role. So even if you're not a civil engineer, you're told how to play the role of a civil engineer. And if you're a business person, you play the role of that business person. And then you figure out how to solve this problem within that role. So again, you're simulating this interaction of the social and the biophysical system. And these role-playing games are quite powerful. But I want to point out that, see, like I said this somewhere. Let me say this again. It's in these tools I talked about, and in role-playing, we use oftentimes reduced forms of very complex biophysical models. But it's really important that we have sound science when we use these tools and when we do this kind of integrated analysis. And sound science both on the biophysical side and also on the social science side. And because particularly if this gets in the public realm, you don't want to get attacked for the science. You might get attacked for, the results, but you don't want to get attacked for the science because that defeats the whole purpose of what you're trying to do. And also, when you're doing this work, getting back to this slide, obviously you need to understand what are the social needs, what are the stakeholders. The stakeholder are the people that are impacted by a project. So what are their values and needs? And there are a couple of ways you can get them. One is you can, look at literature reviews. So if I want to do a project in a town in Massachusetts, I could probably find some literature that have been done on that town. Also, you can use various kinds of social media and cell phone records to understand human values. But in most of my work, I always find the best way is to ask, go work with the stakeholders. And I want to point out that this asking, when I first started this, decades ago, I was pretty naive about this asking. Asking is working with stakeholders requires a real strong foundation in social science and how to work with the public, how to work with stakeholders and really elicit and really deeply understand what they're saying. So most of my projects, they're very multidisciplinary. And I always try to involve a sociologist or an anthropologist on it to help me figure this out, because I know I cannot do it myself. And it's important that it be done well. Just like the biophysical stuff has to be done well, the social science has to be done well. And so just as an example, you probably can't see this, but this is some work we did in East Boston, Massachusetts. So East Boston is one of the lowest income areas of Boston. And many people there, it's a lot of people there from Central and South America. Many of them have English as a second language. They face racial discrimination and so on. And they also live in this area of East Boston, which is very flat. And it's prone to flooding now when we have a major coastal storm. And certainly with a couple of feet of sea-level rise, it's going to flood a lot more frequently. So we started this process off in Spanish, asking a workshop with about this many people what they knew about climate change. We just walked into this room, and said, what do people know about climate change? And they wrote them down and we sorted them. And what we found is we found three clusters. One is they understood generally the global causes. So I think up there is one thing up there about CO2 pollution. So they understood the general causes. They understood some of the global solutions, like research, God, Kyoto Accords, Al Gore. This is done a couple of decades, about 10 years ago. So they understood some of the global solutions. And then over here, they understood some of the local impacts. Like this says asthma, health, insecurity, discrimination, sickness, increasing death, end of human nature. So they understood some of the local impacts. What was missing was what they could do. They had no sense what they could do in their own neighborhood to deal with coastal flooding. So we got this by working with a very clever anthropologist who had a process to elicit these viewpoints. So what we learned from this is they don't have an idea on what they can do to locally adapt. So what came out of this eventually, as an example, is this is an area of East Boston as it stands right now. And this area is used to be a large shipping, used to make ships there as an industrial area. Now it's a lot of those things are abandoned. And so it's sort of some of the areas decaying. And we said, what would you like this to look like? And they said this. So they wanted us to green the coastline. And they want us to, first of all, they want us to elevate the coastline so it wouldn't flood. But they also wanted to have it greened so they would have playing fields. So also we could create ecological habitat there. Also, they wanted us to create affordable housing. One of the biggest problems in East Boston is now it's becoming wealthier people are moving in because the rents there are relatively low. As wealthier people move in, it raises the rents for everybody else and drives out the people that live there now. So if we make East Boston more attractive by greening it and making it resilient, unless we're careful, we're going to drive out the people that live there now, people we're trying to protect. So they said, look, we want the green, but also create affordable housing. So we drew in this sketch, affordable housing, saying, okay, we're going to green it, make it resilient, but also we're going to make sure you can stay here with affordable housing. And this all came out of just listening to them. Let's see, how long can I go for? How long? I can go 20 minutes more? Okay. Okay. So one of the first experiences I had in working with sociologists on a water problem is some work we did in Burkina Faso on looking at how to introduce seasonal rainfall forecasting to subsistence farmers there. And this project was called CFAR, and it was funded by US NOAA large team working on it. And just to sort of point, that's me in the white shirt at this workshop. And, in this project, that's where you normally found me. I was in the workshops. The anthropologists were in the dirt talking to the farmers. And it's not like I don't like to talk to the farmers, or I don't like to be in the dirt. Just that they don't have the skills to talk to the farmers. And so I want to emphasize that in these projects, you really need a strong interdisciplinary team that can work together. You need people that are strong in the biophysics aspect and strong in the social science part. And so Burkina Faso, this just shows where it is. It's in a climate belt called the Sahel. They get all their rainfall in the summer, like the monsoon. The rest of the year it's bone dry. This is the dry season. This is the wet season. It's essentially 80% of the farmers, subsistence farmers, hand to mouth. It's a hard life for these people. And also their rainfall is declining because of climate change. And so the British government, the British Met Service, the French Met Service, the US Met Service, they run these very sophisticated models, which are used to produce seasonal forecasts for their own country. But because these models, you have to model the whole globe to develop a seasonal forecast for any place. As a byproduct, they're also developing a seasonal forecast for West Africa. But before the project started, that forecast, they would just, fax it to the Met Service in let's say, Burkina Faso. And so it would go to the Met Service, and it was usually in English, and it went nowhere. It did not get into the hands of the farmers. And the forecast, the weather, the climate in Burkina Faso is a very difficult climate to predict because it's got the intertropical convergence zone, and the climate, the weather is subject to what happens with El Nino and also the temperature of the North Atlantic. So it's very complicated. So the most they can do is have a tercile forecast. The forecast of the rain, the probability of the rainfall being more than normal, less than normal, or normal. But this is valuable to the farmers. So we're trying to figure out how to get this to the hands of the farmers. And so working with an anthropologist, we worked in like about 20 villages talking about, how do the farmers do their own forecasting right now? And we talked about what information do they need? And we talked about if they had the information, what would they do with it? And then we talked about what's the best way to get the information to them. And the best way turned out to be sort of a workshop process where the information would be presented by the Burkina Faso Met Service, what the probabilities meant. Then the farmers would have a discussion among themselves how they would use the information. Then some of the farmers would go back to their villages. They were key farmers. They would spread the information among the villages. And here's our anthropologist, Carlo Roncoli, talking to some of the farmers. The project was quite successful. We actually developed a methodology, which is parts of which are still being used today to disseminate the forecast. The problem in Burkina Faso right now is they have a repressive dictator-type government, and they're very concerned about disseminating the forecast because the forecast was wrong. They're worried about civil dissent. But this turned out to be good. The work we did informed the dissemination of the forecast in the future. Okay, then another example is going back to the framework of how do you manage climate risk? And this is looking at how to deal with coastal flooding in Boston Harbor. And, as I said earlier, using this framework, of, climate risk is a function of the exposure, like how much flooding is there, what's flooded, the sensitivity of the systems to that flooding, like, so what if something gets flooded? And then it's also a function of the adaptive capacity, like, is there the ability to make change? And so this just shows the extent of flooding in Boston. So on this side is the present flooding, essentially the 100-year storm. So you can see it's just along the coast. On the other side is the flooding that would occur, 100-year flood, if we had, I think, 5 feet of sevel rise, which is possible in Boston by 2100. So you can see massive areas of Boston Harbor, particularly Boston itself, is flooded. And so that's sort of the exposure. And, where did this flood estimate came from? So this just shows where we are. As I said earlier, it's really important when you do this work that you're really using very sound tools. And this study what we were doing was quite important to the state, like how they're going to manage flooding. And so we really wanted to make sure we had the most accurate flood predictions possible under the present and future climate. So we used this model, or I didn't use it, but my coastal engineering colleagues used it, called ADCIRC, which is a state-of-the-art two-dimensional flood model that is driven by offshore wind and pressure fields. So essentially, you set up a grid around the study area, and you drive it with the offshore wind and pressure fields. And then we study how these, then we do another analysis, and we determine how these offshore wind and pressure fields are going to change over time under climate change, and we drive it with that. And so it's an extremely accurate model. And and it requires, all sorts of data, bathymetry, land surface elevation, land cover, obviously the offshore wind and pressure fields, and so on. And also, this shows the grid field. A lot of our hurricanes in Massachusetts actually start, in the southeastern United States, the Gulf of Mexico, or off of Florida. And actually, a lot of them come, those all originate from Africa. And so we actually start our simulation with what's going on in the southeastern United States. And we simulate the way these hurricanes might move up the coast and actually strike Boston in certain directions. The other kind of storms we get are extratropical storms, which come out of the Northeast. We get them in the winter. We just had one a couple of days ago in Boston. And so we also model those with this grid system. And the way we do this is we do Monte Carlo simulation of all these possible storms. So for every climate period, the present, 2030, 2050, we might do 1,000, 2,000 simulations of possible storms that might start in the southeastern United States, or start offshore, and how they travel up to Boston and hit Boston with different directions. And then the offshore grids are quite large. But by the time the grids get to the shoreline, our grids are like 3 meters by 3 meters. So they're pretty accurate. And what the model does is determines for every grid, over 1,000 possible storms, what the flood levels might be. And then we can sort those flood levels and determine the probability of flooding for that particular grid. So it's very, very accurate. So that gives us the exposure. And then the next thing is sort of the sensitivity. And one of the measures we're interested in is, how much damage does it cause to a building? So how do we convert the depth of flooding, let's say for a 100-year flood, how do we convert that to a damage to a building? What we use is the depth damage curves. So a depth damage curve shown here on the y-axis is the percent damage to the building. And then on the x-axis is the depth of flooding. And then across the top, these are developed for a particular kind of building. So this is one for a 2-story building with a basement. And so here you actually see there's some negative numbers there in terms of the depth because the basement gets flooding, it causes damage. So this tells us the percent damage to the building if it got, X feet of flooding. And then we know the cost, we know the value of the building. In the United States, every building has an assessed value. The building might be worth $200,000 to replace it. So if 10% of the building gets damaged, the damage would be 10% times 200,000 or $20,000. So this lets us do the sensitivity. Then also we can lay the flooding on our census information and get the information on what groups of the population get flooded, their income levels, and so on and so forth. So this lets us determine the sensitivity of the system to the flooding. And so with this information, we're looking at a couple of options for managing the flooding. One was to build a large offshore barrier, which would loop across the harbor and protect everybody. So this is Boston Harbor here, right? I'm a little colorblind, so I'm not sure what this pointer is. Where is the pointer? Okay, here it is. Okay, so one idea was to build a, here we go. One idea was to build a barrier from this area called Winthrop over here to Hull. So here's Boston, here's Cambridge, here's MIT, here's Logan Airport, here's East Boston. Actually, MIT's over there. But anyway, one idea was to build a barrier here with 2 gates in it. And these would be large gates, and then they'd be open most of the time. Then when a storm came, the gates would be closed. And so this is one idea. And so we did analysis of this, and we found out that it could have major environmental impacts. We also learned that very interesting analysis here. Originally, you wouldn't have to open and close these gates very much. But as the sea level goes up, you have to open and close them more. And after a couple of decades, you may be opening and closing these 50 times a year. These gates are massive engineering structures, and they would literally just wear out. And so they'll be technologically infeasible after a couple of decades. So we did an economic analysis, and we found out that the benefit cost ratio of these systems were very low, less than 1. So it doesn't make sense. These systems have less economic benefits than what they cost to build. So it doesn't make sense to build these. And then we looked at the alternative to these. And the alternative to these is what we call nature-based solutions. So the idea being that instead of an offshore barrier, we want to elevate the coast and protect it from this water. Good. No, it's yummy. So we want to elevate the coast, but we don't want to elevate our coast with concrete walls. We want to use what we call nature-based solutions that mimic the behavior of a natural system. And so here you see an area in Boston, which is flood prone right now. And you can see this rendering of what a nature-based system might look like. So it's elevated. There's some, these ecosystems are constructed there, but also it's a park. So this system, the elevation protects against the flooding, but it's really important co-benefits. It provides ecosystem benefits, ecosystem restoration, but also really important social benefits. Now, if this is built in Boston, in an area that doesn't have much open space, it's a huge social benefit. So again, here we've taken, a very complex model, a very complex flood model, and used it to try to design a system to manage the flooding that'll also meet human needs, identified human needs. And there are many advantages to these nature-based approaches compared to this massive offshore barrier. In the interest of time, I won't go through them. but there are many, many advantages, both biophysical, environmental, and sociological. And also in terms of dealing with climate change, if you're going to do this large offshore barrier, you'd have to start building it now and guess what the sea level rise might be in a couple of decades when it was built. And so if you underestimate, you're going to have damage. If you overestimate, you've wasted money. But by building up the shoreline in nature-based approaches incrementally, you can build up the shoreline as the climate changes. It's adaptive management. And for those of you that have studied, climate change adaptation, everyone talks about flexible, adaptive, robust solutions. They can adjust over time as the climate changes. You can't do that with a massive offshore barrier, but you can do that with small, carefully placed nature-based solutions. And so we did the study, it came out in May. Then in October, the mayor of Boston said, there's a great idea, we're going to go with it. And he released this sketch of Boston with this green ribbon on it of nature-based solutions saying, we're not going to do this offshore thing. We're going to do this nature-based approach. And the project team for this was, very interdisciplinary. We, engineers, we had planners, we had economists, we had environmental experts, we had a shipping person, we had all the right disciplines, all bringing disciplinary strength, okay? Because you can't do this work, there's your disciplinary strengths, but you've got to be able to work together and meld the disciplines. And I see this work as sort of like, if you're the principal investigator or the project manager, my role is like a conductor of an orchestra. I'm trying to get all these individual parts to play together and have it be a great harmony and result in a great product. So sometimes I get to bring up the economics, or bring up the social science, or bring up the modeling, but you have to get everybody working together. And then I'm not going to go through this, but the other work we've done is looking at, how can you actually evaluate some of these social benefits? So we've done some work in trying to monetize them. Now I'm just going to end by saying, I used to teach, before I was at UMass Boston, I taught at a school called Tufts University. And we started this program called Water System Science and Society, which was really about integrated water management. And the idea was to train graduate students on how to do this work. And the students essentially took core courses. So they took core courses in systems analysis, science and technology, water planning, biology of water and health, and so on. All the major disciplines. So engineers were taking this biology course. Planners were taking some of the engineering course. But the courses had students of all the disciplines in it. And so the students, by taking the course, would also be learning to work together. Then, of course, there was a practicum and they did research and so on and so forth. So, but it was really training people, also the premise of the program was you got your degree in a particular field. You had to have disciplinary strength, but also to learn to work across disciplines. So that's what we were trying to accomplish. So that's all I got. And I want to thank you for your time. I'm sorry I went a little bit over. You guys are very patient.
Thank you, Professor Paul, for that talk. I think one thing it does help us is that the goal of the seminar series was to bridge the idea of the sciences and the social sciences. And I think your talk has in a way sort of opened the door for that. I do have some questions of my own, but I will ask the audience if they have any questions. I'm sure they have many questions. So we'll maybe pass around the mic and so maybe you can introduce yourself and then we can ask the questions. Yeah.
Hi, Paul. This is Udit here. Good to see you and excellent talk. Oh, so uh, we typically say that the most credible resolution of the model is limited by the most credible input data that we are feeding into the model. So while 3 meter resolutions to model flood or any hazard are really impressive, but when we go to the damage, specifically depth damage data, these are more of an extrapolation at much larger level. So what the trade-off between settling for a coarser resolution and high accuracy data and vice versa?
You know, when I visited your lab, that's why I was so impressed by you trying to model the physics of individual buildings as the flooding occurs. You know, in our work, we're very good at getting the flood elevation on as it goes through the land, and we model the buildings with the roughness coefficient. So it's nowhere near as accurate as what you're doing. My feeling is that with the speed and cheapness of today's computers, we should be as accurate as possible, because there's going to be some other place in the project where you're not going to be able to be that accurate. And so my attitude is always control the accuracies you can, because there's some areas where you can't control the accuracy. And in that case, you have to do sensitivity analysis. So many of my colleagues go crazy because I say, you know, let's be more accurate. And they say, well, it's just really time consuming. It costs a lot. But then I say, you know, it's really important we be as accurate as we can, because there are places where we can't be accurate. So I'm all for going the smallest scale you can. And there's really, you know, as appropriate to the problem. But again, I really strive for accuracy. So that's a great question. So that's why I'm so excited about your work. So how many of you were students? Okay. And most of you in Earth Sciences department? Okay.
Okay. So myself, Nilesh, I'm a PhD student in Humanities and Social Sciences department. So I'm not from technical background. So as my background is where like focusing on more social angle. So my question is in terms of climate change and the flooding. So particularly exposure and sensitivity in that part uh, and adaptation again. What we can really focus in that angle, if you can elaborate more.
So I think the question was, what can you do here to adjust to climate change? Is that right? Yeah. Yes, from the social science side. Okay, so, you know, the biophysical science side, the engineering side, is looking at what the exposure is, like what assets are being impacted by the present and future climate, like, you know, what buildings, what infrastructure systems, what people, what livelihood systems. But the biggest question to me is so what? What's the sensitivity of the systems to that exposure? So what happens to the people if they get flooded? What happens to their homes? What happens to their livelihoods? What happens to what we call, key assets? So that to me, those are social science questions. Like that, what's important to them? The other question is the so-called adaptive capacity. Like, how can a system that's been impacted by climate change adjust to the changes? Like, do they have the capacity to do that? So again, you know, a poor person does not have the capacity of a wealthy person. You know, in the simplest case, a wealthy person can just move away from climate change. They can buy their way out. They can air condition their home. A lower income person cannot do that. So once you understand the sensitivity, the adaptive capacity of the system, you can ask the question, how can I change those to lower the risk? And so understanding the social dynamics, you can say, okay, maybe we can adjust their livelihoods. Okay, maybe we can say when the temperature gets above a certain amount, people have to be inside. In the United States, we have to make sure we provide cooling shelters, make sure we plant more trees to provide cooling. So the question is, how can we adjust the sensitivity? The adaptive capacity is, what can we do to help a segment of the population better deal with climate change? So one of the things we talk about in the United States is education, making people aware of the climate change threats. And that has two parts in the US. One is they understand the threat. They might adjust their own behavior. They might be prepared. They might have, let's say, be prepared if the house gets flooded. Have material they want to take with them, their passport, money, if they have to leave their home. Okay. But also, if people are educated, we hope that creates political will and they vote for people that are going to take the right kind of action. So we talk a great deal about education as a way to increase the adaptive capacity of our people. So I see the social dimension of climate change is so important. The ways to manage the sensitivity and manage adaptive capacity. And of course, there are engineering ways to decrease the sensitivity, better cooling systems, move buildings, and so on. But the human dimension is really important. And we really can't do without the human dimension. So it has to go hand in hand. This is a long answer. I hope that was helpful. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Camelia. I'm a PhD student. So my PhD is also kind of interdisciplinary. So I wanted to ask about the agent-based modeling of when you talked about, and when we are talking about these modeling aspects, can we also consider intangible aspects like, intersectionality, when we can bring in caste, class, race, and gender into when we are doing this kind of modeling? And if it is also possible, when we are looking into the impact of it, it's more like generalized impact, but can it be localized in a much more like local level? Because when we are doing is generalized, it might not actually go into a very specific community or specific requirements. So yeah, just wanted to know whether it can be done or not.
Okay, yeah, so agent-based modeling can be applied in a very small scale. So actually, a colleague of mine, Amit Patel at UMass Boston, used agent-based modeling to understand slum dynamics in India. So he's actually working in small slums to understand what's going on, and also ultimately thinking about ways to manage it. So agent-based modeling can be applied at the neighborhood level. Okay, our work, because the problem we're looking at is what's the best institutional structure to manage flooding in Boston, whether we want, sort of the free-for-all system we have now, or some level of cooperation, or even want to have a central authority in charge of adaptation, is to test out if we had those various levels, how the coastal resiliency would change, and also how it would impact the cost. In theory, if there's one regional person, one regional agency, they're going to do the most cost-effective solution for the whole region. If everybody's just sort of taking care of themselves, it might be very inefficient. So, but on the other hand, the regional authority, because it's a regional authority, itself might be inefficient because it's going to need political support from the whole community. So there's a trade-off there. So we hope to explore that with the agent-based model. So in our case, we're using the agent-based model in a somewhat idealized case, but it can also be used in a lot more specific case. And also, if you want to get involved in agent-based modeling, there's all sorts of code out there, and it's tutorials. So there's the code most people use. I think it's called NetLogo. No, I think it's NetLogo or something. Anyway, my graduate student I work with is doing it. So of course I don't know the name of the code.
Hello, my name is Aanchal. I am a PhD student in the social science department. So I wanted to know your experience of sharing your findings and results with the policymakers, and like what challenges do you face? Because oftentimes policymakers work in an environment where they are dealing with conflicting and competing priorities. So how can researchers influence policy, and how has your experience been in that?
Okay. It's interesting. I don't intentionally start off, in my case, okay? I'm not intentionally starting off trying to influence policy, okay? I'm trying to look at an interesting problem that has some relevance and that people are interested in. But because I'm looking at human dimensions and policies about the human, about trying to improve the human condition, policymakers oftentimes learn about my results, and then they use them. So what I've learned from that is, first of all, make sure your results are bulletproof, because you don't want to be attacked for any part of what you've done, because then the policy is never really addressed. So you really got to be sure on what you've done. The other thing is, everybody says policymakers are afraid of numbers. And I find quite the opposite. I find the policymakers do want numbers. They want to know, if we had this policy to encourage small scale, if we introduced a subsidy, let's say 10%, to encourage the use of small scale hydropower, is that better than 15%? Or is that better than, 5%? And how much better is it? And so we had this model we were using, and I kept telling the policymakers, it's approximate. It's not an exact number. But they couldn't understand that. They thought this model was quantitative. They couldn't understand that the result was not an exact prediction of what was going to happen if they had a 10% subsidy on the cost of the hydropower. But so I find that decision makers do want numbers, and you have to be very careful when you explain a number that there are certain limits on the number. But like I said, my work gets picked up by the policymakers because they're trying to address, because I'm doing this sort of relevant research. And sometimes it's some of the first time this kind of research has been done. And so they need something from it. So they contact me. But when I do talk to them, I make sure the results are really good and sound and really defensible from all kinds of attacks. And I explain to them as best I can what happened, what the meaning of the results is. And, even if the politician doesn't understand it, their staffers, at least in the United States, they're eager to talk to you. So, yeah.
So I was curious to know about, since I come from a sociology background, so I was curious to know about the role of sociologists and anthropologists who were helping you in your projects in Africa. And did you find anything similar for your work in Boston? And follow up to that would be that since we're talking about the human aspect, we seem to be living in this age of the Anthropocene, and by extension, the capital was seen. So if we are talking about nature-based solutions, which have already been been adversely impacted through capital expansion, how can we reverse the damage being caused through this, through a sort of a tech and social perspective?
So I think you were asking, how can we reverse some of the damage that's been done using this integrated approach? Okay. So my approach is to break the problem down. So using this framework of exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, I can determine if I in theory, what is the major driver? What are the major drivers of the problem? What are the key variables that the system is sensitive to? What are the key variables among exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity that are causing the problem? And then I can look at that and say, how can I adjust that variable? And the adjustment of that variable is something I can do. Maybe I can use an engineering approach, or I might have to use a social science change, like a behavior change, or more education, or something else like that. So the way I think about it, the way I try to correct a problem, let's say, is I look at what's causing the problem by component, and then I say, how can I adjust the components? And in the ideal world, you can quantify the components. Like in theory, okay, you can put dollar values on the damage. You can put both on human damage as well as environmental damage. And so you need indicators. And then there's a whole lecture about indicators, right, and metrics. But if you can assign metrics, whether the dollar or something else, to the various drivers and quantify, what the overall risk is, then you can just change those and see which are the most important ones, and concentrate those efforts on that. So that's how I try to isolate where the problem, what's causing the problem, and then I look at it as an engineering solution, or human dimension issue, or is it both? That's why it's important to have this. That's why I went back to this thing about the framework. So if it's the the driver impact state response, it's a framework, and then you can work from that.
Yeah, I have a question about the students.
About what?
About the students. So in the last slide, you mentioned that students gets trained on different different skill sets, ranging from modeling to social science and the humanities aspect. And the team was a multidisciplinary team which was working on those projects. So the input of the students are also also from the multidisciplinary area, or the students are only coming from a single stream, but they get trained in the multiple disciplines. So how do you plan those training of the students?
Can you repeat that again?
Okay, so my question is that the input of students coming into that multidisciplinary studies, you take the students only from a single department or single skill set, or they are coming from the different skill set and get trained on the different knowledge set?
Okay. The water program. Is that what you're talking about? The educational program?
Yeah, educational program.
Okay.
So in the last few slides.
Okay.
Which you
And so
mentioned.
the question was, where do the students come from? Is that okay? So this was Tufts had 6 individual schools. Like we had an engineering school, we have a planning school, we had an international school, we had a vet school, we had a nutrition school, we had a liberal arts school, and we had graduate programs in all of them. And managing water cuts across all those disciplines. So we had students, in theory, every one of those schools in the WIS program. And they were all, taking the 4 core courses together and learning to work together. So in a class, I would have, as I taught the class on integrated water resource management. So in a class, I would have some international students, I would have engineering students, I would have veterinary students, I had a dental student. And we were, all learning together and, bringing our disciplinary knowledge to the class, but also learn to work together on class projects. And the challenge is, some of these kids already know a lot about the material, like the class on water and health. So if you're from the med school, you already know about the health. And so the challenge is how to keep those students interested. And the way in theory was that they'd be working with students from other disciplinary backgrounds and helping to educate them, but also learning from them about how their work influences public health, let's say. And so it was a very difficult program to administer. And after I left Tufts, the program, is not doing too well. But yeah, when it worked, when I was there, it was a really great program. It was a tremendous amount of fun to work in it. But yeah.
Your focus on use of sensitivity and capacity amounts to considering first order derivative with variables, because their sensitivity is a derivative of two variables. Same thing about heat capacity.
Yeah.
So my question is that if relationship is highly nonlinear, how much reality can be captured by first order term of a Taylor series? I mean, first order derivative is just the first term in a Taylor series.
I think you're asking, I'm just using, I'm only using very few variables.
Yeah.
And
So sensitivity is first order derivative. Same thing, capacity. So if my relationship is between variables is highly nonlinear, how much reality I can capture by just using first derivative?
okay, so you're saying that sensitivity is highly nonlinear, or relationship among the exposure, sensitivity, and depth capacity is nonlinear? Is that what you're saying? They might be nonlinear. Okay.
No. Even calculation of sensitivity between two variables, I just take first derivative.
Yeah.
Same thing about capacity. So if my relationship is highly nonlinear, how much reality I can capture by using just first term of a...
Yeah. I've never thought about it that way.
It occurred to me when you were explaining to, when you were answering the question, it occurred to me that you are taking just first order term.
Yeah.
And making decisions. But if reality is highly nonlinear, then first order term doesn't, it gives something, but not very realistic.
Yeah. No, I think I understand generally what you're asking. And I never really thought about that. I know it's difficult to combine the terms. Okay, so, getting one number, which represents climate risk, looking at the exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, you just can't add them. I understand that. But the fact that the sensitivity is just sort of is just one representation and might be, is more complex than I'm making it out to be. I think you're saying it's more complex than you think it is. Is that what you're asking?
No, I was asking that if you calculate sensitivity, it is a first order derivative between two variables.
Yeah.
Same thing about heat capacity. So if I rely just first order term of a relationship which is highly nonlinear, if they are quite close to linear, I can be all right. But if they are highly nonlinear, I mean,
I don't have an answer for you, but I'd like to talk to you more about this afterwards, because I never really thought about that. That's why you need to work cross disciplines to get questions like that. So thank you. I do want to talk to you about that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, this was indeed a very good talk, and a lot of interdisciplinary issues were talked about. One thing I wanted to know from your experience, one of the important components in this is the local people, is the local community. And when we talk about vulnerability, for example, then it's a function of the adaptive capacity. The adaptive capacity also includes the capacity of the local people to handle situations, for example, the coastal floods, which you talked about, or other things. Now, how do the scientists working on this really communicate with the local people, local communities, and what is done there so that the capacity of the local people to handle these disaster situations by the time the governance reaches there, because the government machinery always takes some time to reach there. So there is a lot of thinking, at least in India, that we should empower the local communities. We should probably train the local communities in areas which are more prone to floods or coastal disturbances and all those things. So this is usually done in India, which I wish was different. This is usually done in India by the government machinery. Okay. And in this process, the researchers and the scientists are hardly involved in this. I do feel that they should be involved. There will be better communication and sort of there is always in the local people also, there are some groups, for example, the school teachers and the young boys and girls and all, they can really be trained to handle situation, and they can really be told the technical things in simple words, technically correct, but not technically loaded kind of a communication. So what is being done there? Is there anything like this being done? And what is the experience? What are the problems in this?
Okay. In my experience in Boston, okay, there's also this concern about the gap between a disaster occurring and getting government response. And so one of the NGOs I work with is developing what they call a climate resiliency network. And so they're connecting people in neighborhoods. So if disaster occurs, people will check on other people and make sure they're okay. Because they realize there's a period between the disaster and the time the government get in there. But the design of this sort of climate resiliency network, it has to be done by someone who understands the neighborhood, understands the characteristics of the population, and know what has to get done. So it can't be done by an engineer. It's got to be done by anthropologists or sociologists or an expert in hazard management or a public health person. But you're right, there is this gap between the disaster and the time help gets there. And, when Hurricane Sandy struck New York City in, 10, 15 years ago, they found that the neighborhoods that were least impacted were those that had this quality called social cohesion. They could take care of themselves. And so since that time, there's been a lot of emphasis on building the social cohesion of a neighborhood. Whatever that means, that's what they're trying to do. That people know each other, take care of each other. Things that you would hope would happen naturally, people taking care of their neighbors. But, with the way lifestyles are today in the US, we're often isolated by our neighbors and so on. So this is an area to break down those. There's an idea to break down those barriers.
I think the Q&A can also continue outside the hall because I think we have also run out of time. So once again, I thank Paul for his wonderful talk. And as is the tradition here, so I invite all of you to come here for a group picture with Paul so that we can have, because since it's the first lecture of its kind, so we do want to document it, and I'll be happy if all of you can sort of come here and we can have a quick group picture together. Thank you.